sure to hit that subscribe button. I am filming every single day for the rest of October. So today we're going to be talking about channelings or changelings. I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce it. I've always pronounced it channel. But it could definitely be changelings. So I was actually really, before I get into what they are, I was actually really terrified of these after having Sebastian. And there's one night in particular I remember that my cats were acting really strange and they kept staring at the wall, and Sebastian was in a bassinet at that point. And I was so afraid because I couldn't see a bug or anything that they were staring at, and I kept waking Jeff up saying how I was scared that the fairies were going to take Sebastian. But I was really scared that fairies were going to take him and he was going to be a channeling, and when you're a new mom, your emotions are all over the place, so there's that. But let's get into what a channeling is. Probably they switch up how I say it because I'm not really sure the right way to say it. Some believe that the origin of a changeling comes from a very dark corner of the mind. If a family is unable to care for a child, particularly one that they feel will have no benefit to them in the future because they had an undiagnosed condition or a deformity, it was much easier for them to kind of blame the child dying on fairies and changelings than to admit that they caused or didn't do enough and their child died. Now, infanticide it's a very horrible thing, but it was very common and it was very real. It was a very real part of living in medieval times. And the fact that channeling tales were so frequently, like in the tales, it was so common to hear about the changeling's appetite and how much they needed to eat and how much what they would eat. It suggests that some families of those very unfortunate children saw those children as a threat to the rest of their family's existence. So they kind of let that child die simply because they deemed it in their minds that it was their family or the child, and they kind of separated them from their family in a way, mentally wise, which is just really awful. I don't know how you can look at a baby and be like not see it as a part of your family, not see it as your baby, just because it's eating a substantial amount. Now, there are also those who suspected that their baby was swapped with a changeling and still felt like they needed to love and take care of the changeling. That way, the fairies would return their actual baby. And they were worried that if they didn't show this changeling love and compassion and care for it, that they would harm their real child. Beliefs in changelings were very common in Ireland until 1895. Changelings come from European folklore, and they are basically a deformed fairy child that is put in place of a human child. Now, there's different versions of what a changeling could be. It's not really so cut and dry, like this is what it is, in the fact of what the changeling is. So, like, in some cases, it's a deformed fairy child. In some cases, it's a log that's enchanted to look like a child. In some cases, it's, an older fairy or a sick fairy. So, it kind of, changes depending on the story. In some cases, fairies could be often associated with the devil. I mean, personally, I've never associated fairies with the devil. But there are stories that back in the day, linked them to the devil in these stories, So according to legend, the human child would actually be given to the devil or would be used to strengthen the fairy stock. Return of the actual human child could be affected by making the changeling laugh or torturing it. Some people actually believed that channelings stemmed from the idea that infants were the most susceptible to demonic possession. With changelings, often the baby or child or person might become ill and may take on some strange appearances. Or they might even not be able to move or lift their limbs. Now, this was called being fairy struck. So when they couldn't move their arms or their limbs, or when they got like really ill, it was being called fairy struck. In medieval times, children that had deformities or illnesses that couldn't be explained, or conditions that were just simply unexplained, people believed that they were changelings. Now, the child would be taken for different reasons. One would be to act as a servant for the fairies. Another one would be for the fairies to receive the love of a human child, or sometimes for malice or revenge. So if you made a fairy super angry, they could take your child, essentially. So most of the time, the exchange was made with a fairy change. So they would either switch it with a very sick fairy or a very old fairy so that they can live the rest of their days in comfort of a human caring for the fairy. And in other cases, they would leave an inanimate object and just enchant it. So, like I said, like a log, which I feel like that's like the worst possible case scenario. Like you are caring for a log and not your baby. Which, in the show Magicians, I don't remember all the characters' names, but I know that the one girl ends up, her baby gets taken by the fairy queen, and she is actually caring for a log. And it shows that she's caring for a log, but that she thinks it's a baby. And usually it was the most beautiful children or people that were taken by the fairies because these were qualities that fairies really enjoy. Now, to prevent a child from being taken by the fairies, iron was often left by or in or near their crib, usually in the form of fire tongs or scissors, which seems like an awful idea to put in a crib with a baby. Scissors or tongs, like fire tongs, those are sharp. And it was warned to never look upon a baby or its parents with envy. Otherwise, that would increase the chances of the baby being taken. And since in that time, fairies were often linked to the devil, it was believed that baptizing a baby very quickly would drastically decrease the chance of it getting abducted by fairies. And if you did everything absolutely right, it could still happen, which is terrifying. Now, there was a Welsh widow woman who the fairies tricked into thinking that her cattle was in distress. So when she was, checking on the cattle because the cattle was in distress, or as she thought, the fairies took her little boy and switched him with a changeling. Now, with the help of a local wise man, she actually ended up getting her son back. Even if you successfully get your child back from fairyland, there could always be that, pull where they want to go back. They never feel like they're home. And it was believed that the child must be returned before eating any fairy food. Which, again, I know that I mentioned this in another video, but if you guys have any idea what the name of this movie that I'm going to talk about is, I would love to know, because I'd love to watch it. Pretty positive it's a cartoon. I know one of you guys said Ferngully last time, and I love Ferngully, but I know it's not Ferngully. But it's essentially this brother and sister who go to fairylands, and the brother ends up eating fairy food, even though they were warned not to eat any food. And I know that the sister ends up trying to, be able to get him to come back to the human world, but the fairies want him to stay because he already ate the food. And I used to love the movie, but I don't remember the name of it, and I haven't remembered the name of it in years. So if you guys have any idea what I might be talking about, definitely comment down below, because I would love to watch it again. But the legend that I was just talking about with the widow woman and the wise man is called the Legend of the Widow of Linefaban. The wise man instructs her to do very unusual tasks, including brewing beer in an eggshell and cooking a fully feathered chicken. Now, performing these tasks can kind of entice the fairy to kind of slip up. And he'll forget himself and pass a remark like that he's never seen anything like that despite being as old as the hills. Now, when that happened, the channeling would disappear and the human child would be returned, because then the channeling kind of just gave himself up. But there were actions that were so much harsher that people attempted to get their children back. And they included actually burning and drowning a child, which I get these people firmly believed that this was not their child. But I couldn't imagine ever doing that. Just because what if I was wrong? I would much rather, try every safe method possible, or try to find the fairy realm and get my child back myself, instead of resulting to that. In one case, 1884, Anne Rausch drowned 3-year-old Michael Lay, who could not stand or speak. So he was 3 years old and he couldn't speak a single word, and he couldn't stand at all. And she ended up drowning him because she thought that he was a changeling. Now, probably the most famous case that you come across when you research about changelings is the case of Bridget Cleary. Now, there's even a nursery rhyme that was created after this case happens. And the nursery rhyme goes, "Are you witch, are you fairy, or are you the wife of Michael Cleary?" Now, Bridget Cleary was said to be very quiet and polite and a very independent woman. She actually worked as a seamstress and was married to Michael Cleary. So after 10 years of marriage, they still had no children. So Bridget would enjoy her own company and often go for walks around the nearby fairy forts on her way and visit neighbors or customers. Now, after a very harsh winter, Bridget fell severely ill in 1895, and she was only 26 years old. Her husband, Michael, brought her to bed and then went to try to get the closest doctor. However, it'd be about a week before the doctor would finally arrive. Michael watched his wife badly deteriorate right in front of him, and that's a very hard thing to see. He turned to herbal medicine because he didn't know what to do. And then he convinced himself that she had been taken by fairies and replaced with a changeling. So this led to him, along with the help of a few villagers, to try to get rid of the changeling. And they used very extreme methods to do that. Now, Bridget was found in a shallow grave where her body was burned as an attempt to get rid of the fairy. So they literally burned her because she was sick and they thought that she was taken by a changeling, which maybe she was, but I feel like it would have been smarter to still try to take care of her and to still, maybe try some of the other, like, unusual safe methods first. And even get a doctor to look at her instead of resulting to something so drastic to somebody that you love so much. Now, many people believe that fairy babies were very ugly and troublesome, whereas human babies were very docile and beautiful. And since fairies were always very attracted to beauty and music, it wasn't just babies at risk, it was also young men and women. Some people believe that a fairy would need human food to thrive, and that was actually the reason for the exchange. The Scots believed that the fairies had done a deal with the devil, and that every 7 years they had to give a sacrifice, and since they didn't want to sacrifice one of their own, they would take a human child or person and sacrifice them instead. Crossbreeding was another big motivation for them, and it's said that instead of allowing their bloodline to become choked, that they would mate with humans in order to inject flesh blood into their clans. Now in Ireland, fairies were always treated with respect. Midwives and new mothers were often favored by the fairies because they could make good servants to the fairy queens and easily tend to the fairy children. And it's also said that fairies find childbirth very difficult. And even if the pregnancy lasts several months, that the babies that survive are often deformed or stunted. Now, occasionally some people leave the mortal world, live in the fairy realm by choice, which I feel like that would be me. I mean, obviously, Jeff and Sebastian would come with me. But I would live in the fairy world. Would you? I like that, but fairies.
Can't tell you no.
But you'd have to come with me.
I know.
Okay. Jeff said he'd come with me. So, if one day we all just disappear, maybe we're in the fairy world. Or maybe not. So, just pay attention to that. Now, the people that choose to live in the fairy realm usually will not stay in the fairy realm for a super long time. Like, they won't spend the rest of their life in the fairy realm. However, when they return, they will be different in some way. So the people that know them will realize that they're different. They will return usually with a gift and often be a master of either herbal or magical knowledge. Now, babies and children are at a much higher risk to be taken by fairies because it's much easier to integrate them into the fairy culture and their society, and it's much more likely that they're not going to remember their parents if they're taken at such a young age. Now, most changelings will have very dark eyes, and it's said that if you look into them, you can see wisdom well beyond their age. But I guess it's like the same with some humans, because they're called like old souls. Like some people have like old eyes, where it's when you look into them, they look a lot older and like more filled with knowledge. Now, changelings will also grow and develop a whole lot quicker than a human child. Within a few weeks, the changeling will have a full set of teeth, and their arms and their legs will be bony and thin. And the changeling's family will never have good luck anytime a changeling is living in their house. So that entire time that the changeling is there, the family will just not be able to have any good luck because the changeling will drain any good fortune that comes their way. However, if the parents ever want to see their real child again, their best bet is literally just to love and care for the changeling like it is their own child. It is said that if the changeling is harmed or abandoned in any way, that the fairies will do the same to your child, if not worse. Now, trooping fairies often leave their homes several times a year. So during this time, it's very possible for you to sneak in and get your real child back. However, there's magic, spells, and rituals that need to be involved in this. Another method, which is by far the safest method, is to nurture and love the changeling so much that it becomes a happy, healthy child. And the fairies will want their real child back instead, so they will replace it back with yours. In some areas in Ireland, fairies are actually seen as demons. So the stolen person is possessed and not kidnapped. And it is believed that fairies can actually be exorcised. Now, the victim is beaten or tortured in hope that they can kind of expel the fairy out of the victim. But that just seems like an awful way to go about things. Now, in Ireland, it's also believed that fairies are absolutely terrified of fire. And some alleged changelings have been badly burned or even killed in an attempt to rid them of the fairy. It's said that if the changeling ends up spending the rest of its life in the human world, it will actually be very dim-witted. So it won't be very bright. Now, humans in the fairy world can actually adapt a lot better than a changeling in a mortal world. Some humans will pine and grieve for their family that's behind in the mortal world, and they will wither and die, but other ones will actually be very happy and will live a long life in the fairy world that's filled with joy. So essentially, if you suspect that your child has been taken by a fairy and replaced with a changeling, I strongly suggest to do safe methods first. And make sure there is no medical explanation first. Because I think a lot of the cases, there was medical explanations. But I think in some cases, it is quite possible that a fairy took their child. Especially because some cases, it's said that the child, came back. They got their child back. And, the fact that the child, instantly acted completely different. Instantly looked healthier. So, or they heard the changeling say something, that they've never seen something despite being as old as the hills. So I don't think that every case was changeling based when they thought it was, but I'm sure that some of them were. And like I said, I was absolutely terrified of this when Sebastian was an infant. But I guess the most important thing is to just be so respectful to the fairy realm and the fairies. And I think that kind of goes for everything, just to show nature and other creatures and all of that so much respect. But I want to know what you guys think about the changelings, and it's such a dark piece of fairies. I don't really associate fairies personally. If you do, that is completely fine. You guys are all, we're all entitled to our own beliefs. That's more than fine. But personally, I don't link fairies and demons or fairies and the devil. I think fairies, like anything, there's some really dark aspects and there's some really light aspects. So I think that this is definitely a darker aspect of fairy lore. And it's a really sad aspect of it. I know that if Sebastian got replaced by a changeling, I would do everything in my power to go to the fairy realm and get him back. Or end up living there with him. Because he would not be staying there alone. But I want to know what you guys think, and if you liked this video, definitely give this video a big thumbs up. And if you are not subscribed yet, definitely hit that subscribe button. Again, I am uploading every single day this month, so you're not going to want to miss a single video. And I hope that you guys have an amazing rest of your day, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye!